Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to our Humanities class. And for this unit, or for this video, we're going to be starting our unit on medievalism, or the medieval era. And we're going to essentially start with Arthurian legends. But before we get there, I'm going to just say a couple things about this unit overall and this particular time period. So, looking back to where we're coming from, we finished ancient Rome. We took a little bit of an excursus to talk about world religions. And then we took a brief moment after that to discuss the Nordic culture, the Nordic literature, and the traditions that kind of grew out of that. That was essentially to set up the soil in which we're going to get the medieval world, what we know as the medieval world. Now, this particular period of history lasts from essentially the fall of Rome to somewhere roughly in the 1400s, more specifically when we see the Protestant Reformation really begin to emerge. So think of the fall of Rome to the Protestant Reformation, that period in between there, which is almost 1,000 years, is almost a millennia, essentially, is the medieval period, all right? So I traditionally ask my students, what sort of images come to mind? What sort of images, what sort of concepts spring to your mind when you think of medieval in general, the medieval stuff? Most of us will immediately think of the kind of triad of figures where you have kings, you have knights, princesses, fantastical elements of dragons, maybe cathedrals, medieval cathedrals, maybe the Crusades, wars, weapons of, swords and armor and all this kind of stuff. Castles, of course, ornate stained glass windows. These are the images associated with the culture and the kind of iconography around the medieval era. And what we're going to do in this particular unit is, first of all, explore what is perhaps the most legendary or the most well-known collection of literature or stories that come from this era, which are the Arthurian Legends. We're going to read essentially three shortened stories, three shortened tales from a more kind of modern retelling or a more recent retelling or rewriting of those stories, but still keeping some of the major details and the major themes of those texts to this day. Now, once we're finished with that, we'll read a little bit of the medieval philosophers from all three of the major religions. So Maimonides, Ibn Sina, and Thomas Aquinas. And then we're going to discuss just very briefly sort of the more historical, what would you want to say? The historical role that the medieval period plays and why we have a lot of misconceptions about the medieval period. It's probably one of the most misunderstood periods of history, essentially when it's called the Dark Ages, right? That is a particular libel on this particular period of time. Now, once we've done with that, we're going to take a nice long look at Dante's Divine Comedy, and that will be our major work as we exit the medieval period. So as you can see, once again, we're kind of mixing historical and literary sources here quite a bit. But I want to see how we can see them overlap and how we can see the influence of those texts on the history of the medieval era and how also those texts reflect the history and the value of the medieval era. So to begin with, we always start my classes with Arthurian legend. Now, again, a good kind of preliminary is to just ask students and ask you, what do you know about the Arthurian legend? What comes to mind when you think of Arthurian legend? Obviously, we know that it's about a titular character named King Arthur. What do we know about King Arthur? It's like, okay, maybe he pulled a sword out of the stone. He had a round table. He had knights. He had this guy Merlin who was helping him out, all this kind of stuff. We've seen Arthur in some contemporary works. So we see, for example, in the Disney movie The Sword and the Stone, we see him there, the young boy. We see him in the more recent show on the network. I can't remember what network it's on, but the show Merlin, right? He was prominent there. There was a more recent, I think it was a Guy Ritchie film about King Arthur, and that had some elements of the Arthurian legends in it as well. Those are the main ones that come to mind. So the reason I bring that up, of course, is that the Arthurian legends are to this day a very popular source of legendarium, if you want. Now, what is their genre exactly? Because they're not myths properly understood. They are legends. Okay, well, what's the difference? There's a very minor difference here. And essentially, the difference is the difference between mythology and religion. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that do people actually believe in during this period or in the surrounding centuries that King Arthur actually existed and that he, did the things that he is claimed to do, that Lancelot is real, Gawain is real, all this kind of stuff? Probably not. Yet we treat them differently and we write them differently than we would mythology, right? They're not written as a Greek myth would be written. Not entirely, but they're really, really close in the sense that they are using an existing religious structure and a real world setting to tell a story that very clearly has deeper thematic lessons to it. Okay. So I like to, for my students, really reference back to Beowulf when we approach King Arthur. Beowulf, as you remember, was very clearly a fictional story, yet it was set in a real world setting. It had some actual references to real world figures, right? It was not entirely fictional. It was not an entirely new world. It was set within a Christian framework to some degree. At least the writers were very clearly setting the work in a Christian worldview. And so you had God, you had devils, all this kind of stuff, but you also had dragons, right? You had some mythological elements. Well, if you took that and you developed it even more and you had an even longer kind of set of legends surrounding it, that's probably closer to what King Arthur is like. King Arthur's legends, which if you look in the works of whether it's Cretin de Troyes, Meules de France, these other earlier writers of the Arthurian legends, or probably the most popular one, the most well-known one, is Sir Mallory in his Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur. You have the compilation of all these different stories of Arthur, which involve the Roman Empire. They involve the kings and queens of the surrounding areas in Europe, not just Britain. It involves saints. It involves also archbishops and stuff like this. So we see that there's a very obvious, prominent real world element in the Arthurian legends, right? We also see, of course, that Christianity plays a major role in this particular religion or in this particular body of literature, right? We have archbishops, we have priests, we have angels at times appearing, we have miracles occurring, we have different visions of holy figures and holy items, as we're going to see in the middle here. And then curiously, we also have various fantastical, more paganish elements, right? There are dragons, there are, lion companions, there's the hunting beast, right? Which are these, multiformed beasts that come out. We have what are essentially nymphs, right? We have these kind of fairy-like figures. We have a wizard, as we're going to see in Merlin. So it's a really interesting sort of conglomeration of different sources and different ingredients to form this particular text. So I want you to just understand that it's very similar to Beowulf in that sense, but again, more developed, more of a presence of religion, and at some point, it is more broad in what it's talking about. There's a lot more material to be covered. So to begin with, the first major story that we're going to look at is the kind of origin of King Arthur's kingship, right? Now, like I said, if you're interested in the kind of full story of King Arthur, we have that actually compiled in 1485 by Sir Mallory. Sir Mallory writes the Le Mort d'Arthur, which is a two-volume collection of the Arthurian stories. Very straightforward to read, not a lot of nuance, not a lot of intense poetry behind it, so it's relatively an easy read. The other sources, whether they're from Cretin de Troyes, Meules de France, all these other figures, and various other writers, usually are kind of like popping up all over the place. So, for example, one of the most popular ones to read at a high school and college level is Gawain and the Green Knight. That particular text exists on its own. It's not really within any larger written body of work by one singular author. And so that's kind of what we have to thank Sir Mallory for, is he's taken all of those works, all those stories, and really compiled them for us. So we have this kind of long, structured story of King Arthur and his knights, and all the different adventures that they go on, and all the things that befall them. Now, when we begin Arthur's story, it's typical that we either begin with the story of Uther Pendragon or the story of King Arthur as a young lord. So the version that I'm going to have us read is, again, not an original Sir Mallory version. It's it's a newer sort of version that we would have in like a kid's book. And I like to give it to my students kind of as a break, because we've been reading pretty dense texts from this point, or up until this point. So if we look at the actual text that we have for class, it looks like this. And I'll read through the majority of it with you guys today. So we're going to actually try to look at this in some sufficient detail. So the story begins right here. Once upon a time, 1,000 years before Columbus discovered America, and when Rome was still the greatest city in the world, there lived a brave and beautiful youth whose name was Arthur. His home was in England near London, and he lived with a good knight, Sir Hector, whom he always called father. They dwelt in a great square castle of gray stone, with a round tower at each corner. It was built about a courtyard, and was surrounded by a moat, across which was a drawbridge that could be raised or lowered. When it was raised, the castle was partially a little island, and very hard for enemies to attack. Now, we're going to see in a minute that this is only half of Arthur's origin story. Okay, and I want you to keep that in mind as a particular trope that we're going to, discuss for a minute, because it's such a common trope. It's a common element in these quasi-hero's journey stories. On one side of the moat was a large wood, which is a forest. And here Arthur spent a great deal of his time. He liked to lie under the trees, gaze up at the blue of the sky. All about him, old oaks stood like giant guardians, watchful or watching sturdily over the soil where they had grown for centuries. Arthur could look between the trunks and see rabbits and squirrels whisking about. Sometimes a herd of brown deer and shy, dark eyes would pass, holding the graceful heads high in the air. Sometimes a flock of pheasants with brilliant plumage rose from the bushes. Again, there was no sound except the tapping of a bright crested woodpecker, and no motion but the fluttering of leaves and the trembling of violets half buried in the green moss. Okay? So we have this image of Arthur in what is essentially a very idyllic childhood. Right? It's very innocent, it's very connected with nature. And this connection between the structure of the court, structure of a castle of civilization, and also the role of the communion with nature, I want you to keep in mind as well as another sort of interplaying theme within this story. At times when it was dim and silent in the wood, Arthur would hear bursts of merry laughter, the tinkling of bells and the jingling of spurs. Then he would know that knights and ladies were riding down the road which ran beside the trees. Soon the knights would appear on horses, brown, black, and white, with gray ornamented saddles, and bridles from which hung silver bells. Often the saddles were made of ivory and ebony, each set with rubies and emeralds. Knights wore helmets laced with slender gold chains, coats of mail, and links of steel, so fine and light that all together hardly weigh more than a coat of cloth. Usually the legs of the knights were sheathed in steel armor, and their spurs were steel, and even gold. The ladies sat on horses with long trappings of silk, purple, white, or scarlet, with ornamented saddles and swinging bells. The robes of the ladies were very beautiful, being made of velvet and silk, trimmed with ermine. Arthur liked to watch them flashing by, crimson, gold, and blue, and rose-colored. Better still, he liked to see the pretty, happy faces of the ladies and hear their gay voices. In those troublous times, however, the roads were so insecure that such companies did not often pass. Okay, so we have a little bit of exaltation and beautiful imagery surrounding the knights and the ladies. So typical medieval sort of imagery there, right? The exaltation of one's garments, of one's processions, of one's place in the world. We like this, okay? We have a little bit of an allusion to the fact that things are not well in the land wherever Arthur is living. But Arthur did not spend all his time dreaming in the woods or gazing at knights and ladies. For many hours of the day, he practiced feats of arms in the courtyard. It was the custom of England to train boys of noble birth to be knights. As soon as they were old enough, they were taught to ride. Later on, they lived much among the ladies and maidens, learning gentle manners. Under the care of knights, they learned to hunt, to carry a lance properly, and to use the sword. And having gained that skill, or this skill, they were made squires if they showed themselves to be of good character. Then, day by day, the squires practiced in the quintain. This was an upright post, practiced at the quintain. This was an upright post on the top of which turned a crosspiece, having on one end a broad board and on the other side a bag of sand. The object was to ride at a full gallop, strike the board with a long lance, and get away without being hit by the sandbag. All right, so we're giving a little description of jousting practice there for King Arthur. Now, what we're essentially seeing here is what you could see as an echo of Greek, of a more Greek tradition, where we're trying to educate young men. We're trying to give them what is essentially a well-rounded education. So we have, on one hand, the education of manners, proper manners. We have the education of physical feats and how to basically become independent, not to rely on servants. So typical stuff. Now, next paragraph. Beside this, the squires had services to do for the knights, in order that they might learn to be useful in as many ways as possible, and to be always humble. For instance, they took care of the armor of the knights, carried letters and messages for them, accompanied them at jousting and tournaments, being ready with extra weapons for assistance. And in the castle, they helped to serve the guests at table. After months of such service, they went through a beautiful ceremony and were made knights. In the country round about, Arthur, of all the squires, was the most famous for his skill in the use of lance and the sword, for his keenness in the hunt, and for his courtesy to all people. Okay. Key point here, guys and gals, is that the tradition ideally understood in this civilization, in this particular culture, is to imbue humility in its people. So notice that the soldiers, the knights, these figures who would eventually become potentially lords, would have to work from the bottom up. You have to, ideally, again, this does not happen in reality, in the brutal reality of the medieval world. There was a lot of mismatching of this, but you essentially have the idea, ideally, that what you would do is work from a very humble position up to a more noble position, and that is meant to keep you humble, so that you remember the dictates of what we see in the Bible, for example, because again, this is a Christian culture. We try to make sure that our highly born people, or our lords, or our people who eventually will have authority over others, remain down to earth and remain respectful, if you want, of the tasks that they would have done. And of course, where do we see the precedent for that in Christianity, which is again the dominant influential religion of this particular culture? We see that, of course, in the role of someone like Jesus, right? Of Jesus's very humble position that he takes, whether it's in serving the disciples, whether it's in healing people on the streets, whether it's in living in a very kind of meager and meek sort of way, all the while being God, all the while being the King of Kings. Okay? So we see that reflected a little bit here. Now, at this time, there was no ruler in England. The powerful Uther of Wales, who had governed England, was dead. And all the strong lords of the country were struggling to be king in his place. This gave rise to a great deal of quarreling and bloodshed. There was in the land a wise magician named Merlin. He was so old that his beard was as white as snow, but his eyes were as clear as a little child's. He was very sorry to see all the fighting that was going on, because he feared that it would do serious harm to the kingdom. Okay, 2 points here. So Uther, the first king, is dead, and he's leaving a power vacuum, and no one has been able to adequately fill it so far. And here we have our first mention of Merlin, who was a magician Now, the term magician is a little bit, I'll take issue with that in this particular author's retelling of the story. It would be more accurate to say that Merlin or Merlinus was a wizard, okay? And we'll come back to that in a minute because the presence of this seemingly good or well-intending magician or wizard is interesting, particularly in a Christian story. In those days, the great and good men who ruled in the church had power almost equal to that of the monarch. The kings and the great lords listened to their advice and gave them much land and money for themselves and for the poor. So Merlin went to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the churchman who in all England was the most beloved, and said, "Sir, it is my advice that you send to all the great lords of the realm and bid them come to London by Christmas to choose a king." The Archbishop did as Merlin advised, and at Christmas, all the great lords came to London. The largest church in the city stood not far from the north bank of the Thames. A churchyard surrounded it, filled with yew trees, the trunks of which were knotted with age. The powerful lords rode up in their clanking armor to the gate, where they dismounted, and giving their horses into the care of their squires, reverently entered the church. Okay. So the selection process for the next king, notice this, is brought about through primarily the figure of Merlin, and secondarily through the archbishop, the figure of the church. So we have here, if you want, a partnership between church and magic and wizardry. It's really a curious element in these particular stories. And we see this in essentially the first half of Arthurian Legends. Once we get the court of Arthur established, things sort of turn downhill after Merlin exits the story. But Merlin is such an interesting character for this point because he is frankly, he is a pagan figure. He is a figure who belongs to the old way, the old pagan ways of nature and magic and wizardry and all this kind of stuff. He's a druid in some sense. And yet he works closely with the church. He's actually a friend to the bishops and to the monks and priests of the particular churches where he is nearby. Well, how is that possible? What is going on there? Essentially, what you have is similar to what is kind of a more fleshed out version of what we saw in Beowulf, where we have Christian monks very clearly writing from a Christian worldview, but writing within a pagan framework. So kind of paying respect to a pagan story, but giving it more of a Christian kind of bent to it. I think in the King Arthur stories, you have something similar going on where we have this sort of interesting union between the pagan worlds, or if you want to say it, the best versions of the pagan worlds, according to Christianity, and then the union with their theology, with their religious practices. So I like this because it's kind of the beginning of what we're going to see in the medieval era, or what I like to point out in the medieval era, as it's the beginning of us sort of dispelling a lot of myths we have about the medieval era. So for instance, one of the most common ones, my students, for example, in a religious setting will see this and they'll be shocked. Like, how is this possible? Why are the churches working with wizards and magicians? I thought, they didn't like all this kind of old pagan stuff. Well, they don't fundamentally. But they also will recognize that there is good in some of it. They are, as I can't remember what saint it was, I can never remember, said we should take the spoils of the Egyptians, right? Referring back to the Old Testament. We should take the spoils of the pagans. If there is something good in a religious system in another culture, we should adopt it because, again, basic religious tenet, all that is good comes from God. So if Merlin is obedient to God, although not a typical, as it was, we typically would understand him as a Christian, then he is a friend of the church in that sense. So we see this sort of inclusivism very, very clearly being illustrated from the beginning of these stories. So he helps create this whole gathering at Christmas. All right, now, where is this going to go? Let's look at this paragraph. There were so many of them that they quite filled the nave and side aisles of the buildings, or of the building. The good archbishop, from where he stood in the chancel chapel, looked down on them all. Just behind him was the altar covered with a cloth crimson and gold. and surmounted by a golden crucifix and 10 burning candles. In front of him, kneeling under the great arches, which spanned the church, was the greatest men in were the greatest men in the kingdom. Excuse me. He looked at their stern bronze faces, their heavy beards, their broad shoulders, their glittering armor, and prayed God to make him the best in the land, to make the best man in the land king. Okay. So we have our selected candidates for king. We have the archbishop praying for this to happen. Then began the service. At the close of the first prayer, some of the knights looked out of the window, and there in the churchyard they saw a great square stone. In the middle of it was an anvil of steel a foot high, and fixed therein was a beautiful sword. On the sword was some writing set in with gold, which said, "Whosoever pulls this sword out of this stone and anvil is the real king of all England." Okay. So very familiar story, the sword and the stone, the sword and the anvil, right? Now, if you really look through the stories of King Arthur, which sword is which, that's a kind of a detailed point, right? There is a sword in a stone that's like on a waterfall. There's a sword in the anvil, as we see here. There's a sword that comes out of the lake that is Excalibur. So we don't want to conflate these particular swords all the time. Again, it's like mythology. It depends on which version you're reading. But generally, you just need to know that the different swords play different roles in the stories. So keep that in mind. Don't conflate them in your head. The knights who read this told the archbishop, but he said, "I command you all to keep within the church and still pray to God. No man is to touch the sword until all the prayers are said." After the service was over, the lords went to the churchyard, and each pulled at the sword, but none could stir it. "The king is not here," said the archbishop, "but God will make him known. Meantime, let 10 good knights keep watch over this sword." Okay. The knights were chosen, and then the archbishop said that on a fixed day, every man in the kingdom should try to pull out of the sword out of the anvil. He ordered that on New Year's Day, all the people should be brought together for a great tournament to be held on the south bank of the Thames, near London Bridge. After a few days spent in jousting among the knights, each man should take the trial to find out whether or not he was the king, or to be king. The brave youth Arthur did not know of the contest that was to be made for the sword. Sir Hector told him that he was to go to a tournament, but he did not tell him the reason for holding the tournament. So Arthur rode to London with Sir Hector and Sir Kay, who was Sir Hector's oldest son. I'm sorry, and Sir Hector was with them. Okay. So you can see where it's coming, you can see where it's going. The imagery of the sword and the anvil, the sword and the stone, only allowing the true king to draw it as sort of a divine sign, has been established. Now, keep in mind Arthur's ignorance here. He does not know why he is going to this particular place. He's ignorant of this, right? There's sort of a childishness about him, childlikeness. After they entered the city and had passed the churchyard and had almost reached London Bridge, Sir Kay discovered that he had left his sword at home. Pretty dumb. How do you forget your sword? "Will you go back for it?" he asked Arthur. "That I will," said Arthur, glad of the chance to ride longer in the delightful air. But when he reached their dwelling, he could not get in. The drawbridge was raised, and he could not make the warden hear his callings. Then Arthur was disturbed and said to himself, "I will hasten to the churchyard we passed and take the beautiful sword which I saw in the stone. It does not seem to belong to anyone, and my brother Kay must have a weapon." So he rode on till he reached the churchyard, dismounted and tied his horse to the sapling. The 10 knights who guarded the sword had gone away to see the combats in the tournament. Arthur ran up and pulled lightly but eagerly at the sword. It came out at once from the anvil. He hurried to Sir Kay, who was waiting for him at the London Bridge. Sir Kay knew that the weapon was the one that had been fixed fast in the stone, but he said nothing to Arthur, and the two soon overtook Sir Hector, who had ridden slowly to the field where the tournament was taking place. Sir Kay immediately told his father what had happened, The good knight at once spoke with great respect to Arthur. Sir, he said, you must be the king of this land. What mean you, sir? Asked Arthur. Sir Hector told the wondering youth the reason why he was destined to be king. Then he said, can you put the sword back in its place and pull it out again? Easily, replied Arthur. The three returned to the stone, and Arthur put back the sword. Sir Hector tried to take it out, but failed. Now you try, he said to Kay. But Sir Kay, in spite of great efforts, also failed. Then Arthur, at Sir Hector's bidding, tried and at once pulled forth the stone. At that, Sir Hector Sir Hector and Sir Kay knelt before Arthur. Alas, said Arthur, raising them from the ground, my own dear father and my brother, why do you kneel to me? So I like Arthur's characterization here, and this is actually something very consistent you see, whether it's in the early versions of the texts or Mallory's and even the more modern ones, is that Arthur's attempt to pull the stone is in one of sort of childlike innocence and humility and ignorance too. He fundamentally did this to try to help somebody else. His attempt to draw this stone, which apparently he doesn't know is for the king, is done in order to help his brother. So, and not to be king, right? So there's an interesting kind of fantastical element here that it is someone who does not grasp at power, someone who is a little bit more ignorant of the kind of competitions to power, who would actually be the right one to take it and who might be the one to actually get it. So let's keep going. Nay, my lord Arthur, said Hector, I am not your father. You are of higher blood than I am. Long ago, when you were a little baby, Merlin brought you to me to take care of, telling me that you were to be king. Then whose son am I? Cried Arthur. There are two stories, the one that Merlin tells and the one that old Blaise, the master of Merlin, tells. Merlin brought you to me, saying that you were the son of King Uther and Ygraine, his wife. But because the king was dead and the lords powerful and jealous, he told me to guard you in secrecy, lest your life be taken. I did not know whether the story was true or false, but you were a helpless child, and Merlin was a wise sage. And so I took you and brought you up as my own. Arthur was astonished that he did not ask to hear the tale of Blaise told. He stood gazing at Sir Hector, who said, and now, my gracious lord, will you be good to me and mine when you are king? I will, replied Arthur, for I am more beholden to you than to anyone else in the world. And also to my good lady and foster mother, your wife, who has reared me as if I were her own child. If it be God's will that I shall sometime become king, ask of me then what you will. Sir, said Hector, I ask that you make my son Kay your foster brother, the steward of all your lands. That shall be done, said Arthur, and more. He shall have that office as long as I live. And the three went to the Archbishop of Canterbury and related of him the story of Merlin and all that had occurred. At his request, they told no one else. Okay, so we have the revelation of Arthur's true parentage. He was the true son, the true heir of Uther Pendragon, right? Arthur Pendragon's father. So, and he was brought to these people by Merlin. Okay, so again, we see Merlin's role. We see that kind of older pagan role in bringing about the true Christian king in some sense, the one anointed by God. Which also, by the way, you could, if you're looking for just basic parallels between the establishment of a Christian sort of monarch with the help of pagan figures. You see that in the nativity of St. Luke in his gospel when you see the wise men, right? The magi, who are essentially wizards, are essentially like magicians coming to help bring about the kingship of Jesus. It's the same thing here, essentially, where we see that Arthur, as the anointed king, is meant to be a unifying figure for Christendom, right? The people who are Christians, like the Archbishop and all the knights, and also the pagan world as well. He's meant to kind of bring everyone together, the Jews and the Gentiles, if you want to use the New Testament language. So he comes to the archbishop and they arrange this next little display for everyone. It says this: at the command of the archbishop on the 12th day, which is the 6th of January, all the great lords assembled in the churchyard. Each tried to draw forth the sword, and each failed. Then the untitled people came and tried. Everyone failed until at last Arthur stepped forward. He hardly more than touched the sword than it came away in his hand. But Arthur, who wore a plain white robe, did not think of the beauty and riches. He was very grave, knowing that he was about to take a solemn oath. He bowed his head while the archbishop set upon it the golden crown, which gleamed with jewels. Then he stood up before the people, for his people, and vowed that he would be a good king and always do justice. All the people uncovered their heads and vowed to serve and obey him. And when he smiled kindly on them as he rode slowly through the throng, they threw up their caps and shouted joyfully, "Long live King Arthur, long live the king." Okay, so we have the anointment of King Arthur. King Arthur chose worthy men for his officers, making Sir Kay steward, as he had promised. Sir Ulfius he made chamberlain, Sir Brastias warden. Arthur gave offices also to Sir Hector, Sir Bedivere, and Sir Geraint. After his crowning, the king set about righting all the wrongs that had been done since the death of King Uther. He gave back the lands and money that had been taken from the widows and orphans. He would permit no unkindness to any of his subjects. Thus, at the very beginning of his reign, his people began to call him what? You tell me. See, that's always what I like to, I leave that empty on purpose. I cut that part out. So what is it that they would call him, essentially? King Arthur, the greatest king, the king of the country, all this kind of stuff. What kind of a title would you give to this being, or to this person who is righting all the wrongs? King Arthur the Just, right? This is where, again, I like to teach that a king's legacy and a king's titling, are a huge part of not only the mythic and legendary culture, but also in history as well, right? We have names that are attached to monarchs very frequently, okay? So what would you think that King Arthur's true name would be, right? At least from his first 2 years here as king. So a couple questions now. I'll leave the multiple choice ones for us in class, right? I'm more interested in these. Well, two figures bring about the sword and the stone. That, of course, was the interesting union between the archbishop and Merlin. How would you characterize Arthur in 3 adjectives? Well, we kind of already mentioned that. Humble definitely needs to be one. What form of government is being established here, guys and gals? This is, of course, a monarchy, right? Where we have a mono ruler, a single ruler, a king. It's a monarchy. Now, how does the story of Arthur's crowning characterize the origin of the power and the right of a monarch? Well, it is linked very closely with the idea that God is the one who appoints a monarch. You are God's chosen ruler in some way, whether through providence or whether through divine/miraculous intervention, okay? That's very clearly shown with the appearance of the sword and stone, okay? All right, now identify the 3 main figures or groups in Arthur's court, identify what role they play in the government, and think about what symbolically they represent, okay? So the king, of course, what role do they play in the court? Well, it's the final ruler, the one who kind of gives orders and establishes justice and acts as the one who judges particular actions, particular deeds and cases before him. So what sort of role, symbolic role, does the king have? I like to use the imagery of symbolism of a body, right? So if you want, the king is very similar to the head, right? He's the capus, right? The cap, the crown of the particular structure or the particular nation that he is ruling over. Now, the Merlin and the archbishop, what role do they play in the court? Well, they're kind of the ones who advise and guide that particular king. So you could say symbolically they are sort of like the mind, right? Or they're the heart. So they're the ones that really try to advise and bring up, wisdom from the past and sort of help the king discern where he needs to go in the future. So you could say symbolically they're like the heart, they're like the mind, they're part of the discerning organs of the body. Knights and lords, or lords and knights. Who are these? Well, these are the ones who are kind of ruling or acting out the behavior that the king wants in distant areas where he cannot be immediately present. So, of course, I think the obvious one there would be that they're like the limbs, they're like the feet and the arms and hands of the king for the rest of the country where they are ruling. Okay, so it's a cool, establishment. I mean, of course, the structure of monarchy definitely existed before the story of King Arthur, but this particular opening of an establishment of King Arthur's court shows us, how that structure is fundamentally ingrained in the imagination of the people who made these particular stories, and for a lot of other generations before and after. Okay, so moving a little bit more quickly now, we have probably one of the most famous quests of the King Arthur stories. Again, we're only going to look at 3 stories. That was one. This is the second one, and this is the legend of the Holy Grail. Okay, and again, we're going to skim through it. It's not going to be terribly long, but we need to understand a couple things here. So Arthur has established his court at this point. He has married a wife. There's been, he has married Queen Guinevere, and we have more prominent knights kind of emerging. So let's read a little bit of this and see what it is that we're going to be looking for in this particular quest. In Arthur's court, there were many virtuous knights and ladies, but the best of all was a beautiful maiden, sister to Sir Percival. She was so good that the evil in the world oppressed her, and she could be happy only when she was praying for all the people to be made better. Okay, so in other words, she's praying for relief of people around her, she's praying for the suffering of the world. Once a good old man told her what was meant by the Holy Grail. Grail, he said, is the word for the cup out of which our Lord Jesus drank the night that he held the Last Supper with his disciples. Therefore, it is called holy. There is a tradition that says that for a long time after his death, after the death of Christ, the Holy Grail remained on earth, and any who was sick and touched it was healed at once. But then people grew to be so wicked that it disappeared from the earth. It was said that if a person in our day were only good enough, he could see the Holy Grail. Really see it? Asked the maiden eagerly. Or see it in a vision? I do not know, answered the old man. But either one would be a great happiness. For a real sight of it or a vision would show the person who saw it that he was sinless. Okay? So, an interesting quest or MacGuffin that is laid before the court of King Arthur, the Holy Grail, the cup out of which Jesus drank at the Last Supper. What does it do? It heals you. It also shows you that you are sinless or you are worthy in virtue and righteousness. And this is one of the main motivators of King Arthur's knights and King Arthur himself. It is a quest towards virtue, towards knightly virtue, towards chivalry. That is one of the main motivating factors of these stories, that these knights are trying to not just journey out and, get fame for themselves. They're trying to essentially fix their own character. They're trying to develop their own character. Now, the example of this that I like to give is a story like Gawain and the Green Knight, which was recently made into a movie by A24 Studios. The movie's different than the original text, but it is fundamentally in its core very accurate to the true sort of thematic tone and mood of a King Arthur story. It is meant to be a hero's journey. These are meant to be hero's journeys for your soul, essentially, for you trying to go on a quest to better yourself, to go on a pilgrimage if you want. And so that's what is going to be established here with the Holy Grail, that we want to correct our sins in some way and purge ourselves of our sins and our faults to go and see this beautiful item. Now, notice who is absent in this part of the story. It's not Merlin who's giving the quest. Merlin is at this point in the story gone. He was usually, depending on the version, he either left or he was trapped/killed by Morgana Le Fay in most versions, okay? So, Arthur's stepsister. So we continue. Then the beautiful maiden prayed more than ever. She became so thin and pale that it seemed as if she were almost transparent, and at last she lay dying. One morning she sent for her brother, Sir Percival, and for his friend, Sir Galahad. Sir Percival and Sir Galahad were the 2 best knights in King Arthur's court. They were not so powerful as Sir Lancelot and Sir Geraint or Sir Gareth, but they had purer souls than these. When they came to the bedside of the maiden, she said, "Oh, my brother and my friend, I have seen the Holy Grail. Last night I was awakened by a sound like the music of a silver horn across the hills. It was more beautiful music than any I have ever heard. Then through my window shone a long, cold beam of silver light, and slowly across that beam came the Holy Grail. It was red like a beautiful rose, and the light reflected from it, covered all the walls a rosy color, and then it vanished. Now I beg you to seek it and go to the hall of King Arthur and tell all the other knights to take the quest. If they can but see the Grail, it will be a sign rather, that they are good and that the world is growing better." Okay, so the Holy Grail appears. One other thing, we have the presence of our main character here, which is Sir Percival. Notice the value judgment. Notice the very clear value judgment here. Sir Percival is not the greatest in the sense of power. So that title belongs to Sir Lancelot. But his soul, Percival's soul, is purer. And that is why he is the best knight. He is the greatest of the knights, right? We are judging him by the content of his soul, not by the simple ability or the impressiveness of his resume. Okay, typical thing, right? You know, my students who follow my fantasy class and read Harry Potter, that'll be totally familiar to them, right? The difference between greatness and goodness, right? Percival is good, whereas Lancelot is great. Good in the sense of like truly being morally virtuous and upright. Okay, the really important stuff for this particular worldview. Okay, so they go forth. As she spoke, Sir Galahad's face wore an expression so like her own that Sir Percival was amazed. But the maiden took from the side of her bed a sword belt and gave it to Sir Galahad. "Fair knight," she said, "I have made this golden belt of my hair and woven on it in crimson and silver thread the device of the Holy Grail. Put on this belt until bind your sword to it and go forth, for you too shall see the Holy Grail." Okay, so go forth, right? Here's my favor. Then Sir Galahad and Sir Percival went away quietly, for they saw that the beautiful maiden had not long to live. That night they went to Arthur's hall. The king was absent with the queen, but most of the knights of the Round Table were there. And to them, Sir Galahad and Sir Percival told the vision that Sir Percival's sister had seen. As they spoke, suddenly the torches in the hall were extinguished. There was a loud sound like thunder and a sudden cracking of the roof. Then a beam of light, 7 times stronger than day, streamed into the room. Across the beam stole the Holy Grail, but it was covered by a luminous cloud so that its shape could not be seen. Slowly it vanished away. There was silence in the hall for a long time. The knights were awestruck and could not speak. At last Sir Percival rose in his seat and said in a low tone, "My sister saw the vision of the Holy Grail. But I, because I am more sinful, have seen it covered with a cloud. Yet because I wish to see it, I vow to spend 12 months and a day in search of it. I will pray and live as holy a life as I can, and perhaps this vision will be mine." Then good Sir Bors, the cousin of Sir Lancelot, made the same vow, and so did Sir Galahad and Sir Lancelot and Sir Gawain and many others. After their vows had been taken, King Arthur entered. When all had been explained to him, his face grew sorrowful. "If I had been here," he said, "I should not have allowed you to swear that vow. None of you really saw the Grail. You say it was covered with a cloud." Then Sir Galahad cried out, "My king, I saw the Grail all crimson like a ruby, and I heard a voice say, 'O Galahad, follow me.'" "Ah, Galahad," said the king tenderly, "you are fit for this quest, this search, but the others are not. Sir Lancelot is your strongest warrior, but he is not like Sir Galahad, is our strongest warrior, but he's not like Sir Galahad. Most of you, my knights, are men with strength and will to right wrongs. That is the work you are fitted for. You have fought in 12 great battles with the heathen, but only one of you is fit for this holiest of visions. Yet go and fulfill your vow. The faces of the knights were downcast. The king continued, while you are gone, I shall need your strength here at home, but you will be following a wandering fire. Many of you will never return. All the company felt sad. The next day, when the knights departed upon their quest, the king could hardly speak for grief, and many of the knights and ladies wept. Those who had sworn the vow went together to the great gate of the city of Camelot, and there they separated. Okay, so there's a heaviness to this particular story. There's an idea that the Holy Grail obviously cannot be attained by all, cannot be seen by all. And Arthur actually says, I wouldn't let any of you go because none of you would be able to really get it except for Galahad. Okay? Now, not except for Galahad, but the majority of you, beside Galahad, would not be able to do this. Okay. Now we're not going to finish the story. All right. We are going to discuss some of the questions here. I'm going to walk through the questions with you a little bit and then have you read the rest as part of our class assignments. So, a couple things. The main topic in the first 5 paragraphs could be described as what? The wickedness of people, nature of the Grail, where to find the Grail. It's very clearly, I think, the nature of the Holy Grail. That's what we're kind of establishing first and foremost. What is the Grail? How do we see it? Why do we see it? Why is it something to be desired? The following paragraphs demonstrate what belief? The physical strength to win the Grail. Lancelot's the greatest knight. Purity of spirit will win the Grail. Percival is weaker than Galahad. I think it's very clearly the purity of spirit is what's going to win us the Grail. Okay. The color of the Grail being crimson, I think really clearly, basic symbolism question there. Symbol of blood, love, and passion, right? Because it's given right before the passion of Christ. After Arthur learns of the vision, he explains that That Galahad is more holy than Lancelot. Not stronger in physical means, but stronger in his spirit and in his character. Now, because all the knights are gone, what additional problem saddens Arthur? His people will miss him. He does not have enough knights to help all his people. He does not have enough knights to fight a war. He wanted to go on the quest himself. Let's take a look, because that's actually a tricky one, okay? So it saddens him. Let's see, blah, 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 blah. You were gone. I also need your strength at home. You'll be following a wandering fire. And let's see. Many of the knights and ladies wept. He knew they would not return. And that's essentially it. So I think that his sadness is because he does not have enough knights to help all his people. Okay, there's not an immediate war, but it's also, I think you could say that his people miss the knights as well. So it's a bad question. I would take probably A or C there. Okay. According to the hermit, what flaw has kept Percival from seeing the Holy Grail? All right. So again, the removal of Merlin opens the door for more traditionally holy figures in a religious sense. So whether it's a hermit, whether it's an old man, whether it's a priest, a monk, all those kind of things. Typically, it's a hermit, right? That's the more typical version for the Arthurian quests. So take a look at the passage with the hermit, and he basically will reveal to Percival that you were unable to see the Grail because of a distinct flaw, a hamartia, in your character. What was that? Take a look. So describe the imagery at the end of this story. What happened to Galahad, right? So something very unique, very interesting happens to Galahad in a very religious sense. So break it down for me based on what you understand about our particular symbolic understanding and our understanding of religion as well in this particular framework. Because remember, you got to remember that the author of this text, of these stories, and the culture in which they developed on was intensely religious. So try to interpret this through a Christian lens and see what you come up with. Okay, so that's the story of the Holy Grail. Now, we have one more, and this one we will read in full because it is a classic, right? It is Le Mort d'Arthur, right? So if you take a look at our artwork real quick, we know we've covered the sword and the stone. We know the origins of Arthur's kingdom, of his court. We then see the whole pursuit of the Holy Grail. Very, very classic, very kind of eternally popular quest in the Arthurian legends. The final one, of course, is the death of Arthur. How is Arthur going to die? It should be no surprise, right? Arthur is going to die, right? The text that compiles all these stories, Le Mort d'Arthur, it overtly says like it's about that particular event. So no spoiler alerts here. Okay. So how does this story begin? Take a look. King Arthur's Round Table had lasted many years, and the knights had done much to help the people of the country. Yet there were traitors to the king among his own subjects. One of these traitors made war in a distant part of the kingdom, and Arthur went with most of his knights to punish him. His nephew, Sir Mordred, the brother of Sir Gawain and Sir Gareth, ruled in his stead at Camelot. Okay. So someone's causing problems. Arthur goes out to correct this knight, to bring this knight to justice. In the meantime, Arthur's nephew, Mordred, is the one sitting there and trying to help solve the situation. Now, Arthur's nephew, well, that's a very polite way to put it. This is definitely a more modern, more PG version of the story. Traditionally, Mordred is actually understood to be a knight that was, or a boy that was essentially begotten from a sexual union between Arthur and his sister Morgana Le Fay, stepsister. And so in that sense, he's kind of this like, wicked child of incest that is going to bring about Arthur's death. But in this version, it's his nephew, whatever. So either way, it's Mordred that's going to be the problem here, okay? You can also see that just in his name, in the etymology of his name, Mordred, right? And the more, that kind of like death root in the language. So what's he do? Now, Sir Mordred was a wicked knight. He hated the king and the queen and Sir Lancelot. Since King Arthur was absent a long time, Sir Mordred had the opportunity of doing much harm. He let evil go unpunished. He allowed bad customs to come into the country. And at last, he raised a rebellion against the good king. Okay, so we have the corrupting power of Mordred. When Arthur returned to Camelot to quell this rebellion, he had lost many of his faithful knights. Sir Hector was dead, and Sir Ulfius and Sir Brastias. Sir Kay was dead, and Sir Bors and Sir Gawain. Sir Lancelot was far away. Sir Bedivere alone remained of those who had been with Arthur since he had last ruled in Wales and Britain. Okay, so in other words, Arthur's court is being stripped down. We are seeing an increased isolation of Arthur and his truly good knights in the face of Mordred's rebellion, right? Really very satanic figure in that sense. He's really seen as sort of an antichrist sort of figure in the court. The king and Sir Bedivere, with the help of such knights as still were faithful, tried to put down those rebellions. They drove the traitors back until they came at length to Lyonesse by the sea. Here, the last great battle took place, okay? We have our climactic battle between Mordred and King Arthur. The night before the battle, Sir Bedivere heard the king praying. Then Arthur slept, and when he awakened, he called to his friend. Sir Bedivere, he said, I have had a dream. I thought that Sir Gawain came to me and told me that tomorrow I shall die. My lord, it is but a dream, answered Sir Bedivere. You are great. You have done much good, which will last forever, and you will live many years yet to perform many gracious acts. The day will soon dawn, and you will win the battle. Arthur shook his head. This is not like my other battles. I have no heart for it. It is hard to slay my own people, even if they are traitors. Day came, but no sun. A cold white mist lay over land and sea. It chilled the knights to the bone. And when the battle began, the mist was so thick that no one could see with whom he was fighting. Friends slew each other, not knowing whom they killed. Some could not fight at all, for it seemed to them that those moving on the battlefield were ghosts of warriors long since slain. There was many a noble deed and many a base one done in that mist. Okay, so it's this terribly tragic scene, and it is obviously kind of a fantastical extension of what has happened to Arthur's court. The story of King Arthur and the fall of Camelot is a story of the kind of the corrupting fall of civil war, right? There was this figure Mordred, who acts as sort of the nucleus of the spiritual cancer that's going to spread throughout this particular court. The mist on the battlefield is, in a sense, just a symbol for the the fog that we are in, the shadows that we are in, that we are not sure what to do, who to attack, who is truly enemy, right? It's a really obscurant and very spiritual image in that sense. So there's a lot of spiritual confusion in this particular scene, and it's terrible because, like it says, most people are slaying each other, slaying their friends, and it's good and evil are mixed together. The fighting went on with clashing lances and shields throughout the afternoon, and when the sounds grew fainter till there was silence, I'm sorry, and then the sounds grew fainter until there was silence. At last, towards sunset, a wind from the west blew the mist away. Then Arthur, with Sir Bedivere by his side, looked over the field of battle. He saw but one man standing; all the rest were dead on the seashore. And the tide had risen and was swaying the helpless hands and tumbling up and down the hollow helmets and the broken spears that once had fought with Rome. The king's face was white and his voice was low as he said to Sir Bedivere, "There lie my slain who have died for me. I am king only of the dead." "Nay, lord," said Sir Bedivere, "you are king everywhere still. Now strike a kingly stroke against the one traitor who still stands." Sir Bedivere pointed at the one other living man, and the king saw that it was Mordred. Arthur threw down his scabbard and lifted his good Excalibur. Right? So Excalibur is drawn. Arthur and Mordred face each other. Then he sprang upon the traitor. Sir Mordred struck the king on the helmet, which had been worn thin in many battles. The stroke cut through the steel and wounded Arthur mortally, but he used his ebbing strength for one last blow with Excalibur and killed Sir Mordred. The king sank to the ground, but Sir Bedivere lifted him and bore him to a ruined chapel near the seashore. When he had laid him down by the broken cross in the chancel, Arthur said, "You know well that my Excalibur was given to me by the Lady of the Lake. I have used it like a king, and now the time has come to obey the writing on the blade. So take my sword Excalibur and throw it far out into the lake." So he goes out, he does this, and a light fell upon the hilt of the sword, as it says in the last here. All the jewels shone. Sir Bedivere looked until his eyes were dazzling. He could not throw the beautiful weapon away, so he hid it in the wheels upon the shore of the lake. And Arthur asks, "Did you do what I asked?" He says, "No, okay, I couldn't throw it in. So you betrayed me, you acted the lie. Go and do it," he says, basically. And he says what? So again, Bedivere went, and the king asks, "What have you seen or heard?" Sir Bedivere replied, "I heard the water lapping in the crag and the long ripples and washing the reeds." He says, "Unkind, you too are a traitor. Because I am dying, I have no authority. You refuse to obey me. Go and do it." So Bedivere is too hesitant to throw away the sword. And what happens? He finally goes, another try, threw it into the water, and it goes down. So Bedivere goes back to Arthur, told him he did as he wants. Arthur says, "I am dying. Lift me on your back and carry me to the lake." And Sir Bedivere carries the helpless king, walking quickly through the place of tombs, over the crags, and past the chasms, until he came to the smooth, shining lake. There beside the bank was a barge, all black, and covered with stately figures of people clad in mourning. Among them were three fair queens, with crowns of gold, the three queens who were to help Arthur at his need. They had come to take him away. Sir Bedivere did not know where. When they saw the wounded king, they gave a cry of grief that seemed to raise the stars. Then they lifted him onto the barge. The tallest put his head on her knees and took off his broken helmet. She called him by name, weeping bitterly. Poor Sir Bedivere cried, "Oh, my lord Arthur, you are leaving me. Where shall I go? The great round table is broken forever. What shall I do?" Arthur answers, "Old customs pass and new ones come. God makes his world better in many ways. The round table did its work and now has disappeared, but something else will surely come to advance the cause of truth and justice. Pray for me and for yourself. More things are done by prayer than the world dreams of. And now farewell. You shall never see me again, my Bedivere. My work is done. Yours too is nearly over. Farewell." Okay, and he leaves. The barge moved out slowly, while those on board lament. Sir Bedivere watched disappear over the shadows of the lake, and he rose slowly and wandered back to Lyonesse. After a time, he went to Camelot. There was a new king there who was good, and new customs, also good. But Sir Bedivere was too old to change his way of life. He spent the rest of his days in Camelot, but he lived only in the past, dreaming of the time when King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table ruled the land. And that's the death of Arthur, essentially. So, a couple things. Let's take a look. We don't need to do the what do you want to call it? We don't need to do the multiple choice questions. They're pretty easy. I want to look at these last couple questions here. Number 6, how does Arthur's last fight with Mordred relate to other mythic battles we have read? Well, I was hoping people could catch this, but it is, of course, an echo of Ragnarok, of that Ragnarok motif, where we have two figures fighting together, clashing, and essentially dealing a death wound to each other, right? So Arthur is not able to soundly kill Mordred and survive. He duels him, but he is wounded in the process, okay? Again, echoing the process that we saw, or that motif that we saw in Nordic literature. However, he survives in some sense. He is, again, doesn't articulate it here, but the legend is, of course, that he is taken to not Camelot, but Avalon, which is this sort of place over the sea, this sort of eternal, undying land over the sea that he's able to stay and rest until he will come again to rescue England in time of need. So we have a Ragnarok, a pagan motif here, but with that Christian element kind of tacked onto it or infused into it. Now, consider the conflict that led to Arthur's death. What type of conflict was this? And where have we seen it in religious and historical stories? So it's a story of corruption. It's a story of betrayal. It's a story of kind of internal erosion, if you want. We saw that in ancient Rome. We see that in the Gospels, right, with Judas's betrayal of Jesus. And it's a typical story that you essentially see in all civilizations, whereas that they are weakened from within. Their luxuries or their corruptive nature is usually unseen for too long, and then that eventually is what erodes them and brings them down, okay? And we see that, of course, here. Finally, what is Arthur's last command, and how does this characterize him as a ruler? He wants to return the sword Excalibur, which is a separate sword, like I said, not the sword in the stone that made him king. Excalibur is something more and more powerful. It's the sword of power, essentially, that he gets from the Lady of the Lake in a separate story. But here, he returns it to her, as he promised that he would, symbolically showing us the abdication of power, okay, the giving up of power, the laying down of power, right? To echo again the Christian idea that that God, just as God laid his glory and divinity aside to do what he needed to do for humanity out of love, so rulers should do. You should not grasp at worldly power eternally, right? You should not do this. You should be willing to hand it down whenever you are called to do so, because you are but a servant, as Arthur kind of saw himself here. And he does it, right? As much as, his knight kind of gets in the way a little bit, he still presses him to make sure. He's like, no, you have to do it. You have to do it. This is my last act in life. I have to give my power back. Okay. So really exemplifying for us and for the medievals as well, the true iconic nature of how a king should act, okay? So walking away from the King Arthur stories, we see a lot of interesting literary things going on with the whole fusion of religion and pagan and historical elements, right? We, of course, see that King Arthur's structure of his particular court, his behavior, acts as an exemplary legend for knights and noble figures in the legends of those particular days. Obviously, was that acted out to the perfect degree? No, but I think that's very clearly one of the many roles that these particular stories had for people back then, right? And we see, again, a lot of tragic elements in Arthur's story. We see, motifs drawn from other sources of literature that are still very prevalent even to this day, right? So that's a quick, very, very quick look at King Arthur. Now, next class, like I mentioned, what we're going to look at is some more historical details about the Dark Ages. In brief, we're going to look at some philosophers and kind of what we can devise from them. And I'm going to drop a couple I'm going to drop a couple things that will dispel typical more popular level myths that we have about the Dark Ages. And as it says down there, they are not as dark as we usually think they are. Okay, so that is what we have. That is others we're going to have next time, and that is all we have for today. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day in the meantime. Bye.